so now that I'm here, sorry, working until 4 o'clock, rush to be here, so we'll go ahead and call this meeting to order. Now, Steve, we need to, what do we need for the
About the last 10 minutes.
So, and I guess I'll turn it over to you. You can take us through what we need to do.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to do a quick round of introductions, and I'm not quite sure how we're doing with the people that are online. If they introduce themselves, can we hear them?
We have no one online yet.
Okay. Well, then let's just do the introductions that are in the room, and and then I'll take us right into the training. So let's just start with that. So Jason, why don't we start with you and kind of work our way down here?
My name is Jason Reddick. I'm the current board chairman.
Deborah Brown, board secretary.
The role of director of student services.
Julie Emmer, board secretary.
Evan Strong, proud student school district parent and business manager.
Sorry, I didn't quite get your name.
Evan Strong.
Thank you.
I'm Barbie Riggs, and I'm the director of teaching and learning.
Colleen Henry, and I'm the Director of Technology.
Susan Coleman, a proud parent and also city councilor.
Lucia Mull, City Communications.
Sorry, one more, your name.
Lucia Mull,
Thank you.
the only Lucia.
Yep. I couldn't even begin to know how to spell it. I was like looking on my list. What is this? But thank you very much. Yes, sir.
Anthony Sitton. Rob Brown, student high school principal.
Janice Albert, youth board member.
Aaron Hoffman, parent and board member.
Jim Gorley, board member. Joe Kennedy, ex-board member, citizen. Bill King, ex-board member, citizen. Blair Larson, parent, work for the city as well.
Thank you very much.
And Steve, we have one person online.
Okay, great.
Hello.
And I don't know if they can they unmute themselves, introduce themselves, or if you can just tell me who they are?
Let's see if she's able to unmute herself. Donna, go ahead. It's Velma Canfield.
Yes, I'm here.
OSBA president.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And the gentleman that just joined us,
Then he's with the New Era.
okay, I assumed a reporter. Thank you very much. All right. Just trying to see who's in the room. And one of the reasons I do this is this training is required before we turn on your account to look at the applicant pool and do the work that we're going to talk about tonight. And if for some reason, if you miss this training, then I have to follow up with those individuals and get them trained before I can turn on those accounts. And while I'm thinking about that or talking about that, your accounts will be turned on probably first thing in the morning. My colleague who normally takes care of that piece, it's actually her birthday and it's her day off. And I'm really, really trying not to bother her on her day off. But those accounts, once we finish this training tonight, should be turned on no later than first thing in the morning. And then you can start your work. Before we dive into the work, let me introduce myself. I'm Steve Kelly. I'm the Director of Board Development for the Oregon School Board Association. I'm starting my 6th year at OSBA. In a previous life, I was a superintendent for a number of years, assistant superintendent. Really, I've done a lot of different jobs in education for the last 38 or so years. I think I stopped counting at 38, but that's the number I keep using. Will we be able to project up on the whiteboard?
I don't think so.
Okay. All right. So I'm sharing my screen with the online folks, but not these folks.
Right.
Okay.
There's no laptop connected to that.
Okay.
Well, he normally does it over there.
Hmm. Yeah, some of this I can do verbally, but there's going to come a point where I'm going to have to show my screen. I'm sorry, I should have thought of that earlier. I assumed and I shouldn't have.
Let me see if I can bring, it's the bias awareness guide that you want to.
Well, I've got that in the training guide, and then I've actually, when I get on the internet, I've got to show them the database.
Well, I'm not getting that.
And it, all right, so I've got a limited time, so I'm going to let the experts problem solve. I'm going to verbally take you through some pieces. And then when we get to the must shows, we will do that as well. Everyone received an electronic copy of everything that I'm talking about. And the first thing I want to talk about is something called the Bias Awareness Guide. So you received that, you probably had a chance to read that. I want to spend just a couple of minutes talking about a couple of points. If you haven't read that, please read through it. It's about a 3.5-page document, and it just talks about an implicit bias, explicit bias as it comes to the hiring process. Now, most of it is around the interview stage of the search, but there's a couple of things there that I want to point out that's going to be applicable to this first phase, which is the application materials. In the first phase, you're going to look at a bunch of electronic documents. You won't be able to print them out. You won't have hard copies of them. So it's going to be important that you be able to access our database and be able to view these files electronically. But the first thing I wanted just to point out was a couple of the examples of bias that's mentioned in the article. And the first one is called a contrast, a compare and contrast type of bias. It's important at this stage of the search that you're really measuring the qualities and qualifications of each applicant individually. You're going to, well, hopefully see, and if not, I'll be able to refer to what the board created, which was the qualities and qualifications for the search. So they are your lens by which you look through the application, plus the other things that you bring. One of the reasons that the board put together a diverse screening committee was you all bring slightly different perceptions, and together you meld that into one lens. But this qualities and qualifications, the list the board put together that was in the packet of materials that you have, it'll also be in the scoring guide that I'm going to talk about in just a moment. But that's your lens when you look at the applicants. Not is applicant A better than B? And when you get down to the very end, thank you very much, then you are going to rank your top 10. You guys are awesome. Thank you very much. Oh, that was completely my error. I should have checked before we began rather than wait until after we started. Thanks for saving my bacon. So you'll see there's a list of different biases that the article talks about. Contrast bias is one that I find that folks see in the paperwork. They'll compare A to B. And really, in the end, even when you give us your top 10 ranking, you're not saying this one's better than the next one. It's which one fits the criteria the best. Who's your top choice? And you're really just talking about who you are recommending for an interview for the next phase. And I'm going to talk more about that in just a few moments. First impression bias is another one that I see. When folks look at the paperwork, many times the format is something that they would do or how they would do it, or they arrange it in such a way that, oh yeah, that's how I would do it. And it's kind of your first impression. It's important to be able to get through all the information that's been a part of the application and then take the preponderance of that evidence and weigh it for your final ranking. This one's hard. And again, all these biases are hard. They're almost always implicit, not explicit. It's not like anybody goes in and looks for good things or bad things and then weighs it unproportionally, but there's what we call the halo or horn effect. If we see something that we really like, it seems to then color the rest of the application review. Or if we see something that really we dislike, I'm not saying ignore it. Obviously, you've got to add that to the evidence that you're looking at, but look at the entire package, the preponderance of evidence. I think that's really, most of these are pretty self-explanatory. Please read through these materials. At some point in time, and I guess now is as good as any, let me give you an important piece of information. So if you have something to write with, you're going to want to write this down.
Yes.
At some point in this process, you're going to have a question. And the only real person that you can talk to is me and not each other. Because outside executive session, you're not allowed to talk to one another about these candidates. So if you have a question about either the process or a candidate or something that you see in the materials, you need to give me a call and talk to me. And so that number is 541-401-3962. Again, 541-401-3962. And I know that you're on a bit of a deadline. So if you call me and I don't pick up right away, please leave a message. And then I'll call you back just as soon as I possibly can. Because again, I know you'll be working under a deadline.
But process questions you can just ask. If there's an issue on the process.
Any question you ask me. Yeah, if it's about the candidates, if you've got a question about something in the materials, if you're, you could only really talk to me. You can't talk to each other outside this executive session. Once we get into executive session and you see who the candidates are, there's no conversation that can happen outside of executive session, quorum or no quorum. All right. You break the privilege of executive session if you start talking about candidates outside the executive session. Okay. Again, just please review the implicit bias document that was part of your material. So let's go to the main event. This document was what was called a training document. It was a big PDF that was attached to one of the many emails that you received from my colleague. And that's the other person that's a part of this search, Sarah Herb. I know you received emails from her. I know she's bugged you about your confidentiality agreements. And if you haven't had a chance to sign those, Julie has paper copies here. Please make sure you sign those before we go into executive session. I'm going to go through this very quickly. In part because I know there's a board meeting following this. I want to make sure the board gets a break before you have to get into that board meeting. And I also know there's a lot of experience in the room in terms of a hiring process in general. And so we're going to get to that in just a moment. So let me take you through these materials. The first piece in the materials is the advertising information that went out to advertise the position, your community, your school district. We put that in there to let you know what was done on your behalf. But also towards the end of this, you'll see there that all the applicants were given the application requirements. They have to complete an application form, again, online, give us a current resume, what we call a letter of interest, some current letters of reference, and then a copy of their administrative licensure or proof of eligibility. And then on the right-hand side was the search calendar that the board approved back in the beginning of the search. So this is all the information that the candidates have. Talks about how to submit, but then it's, oh, where did you go? Oh, okay. I believe we did your qualities and qualifications after we advertised the position. Am I remembering that correctly? We did the qualities and qualifications after we started the advertisement, so it wasn't included in the materials. And we did that because of the timing of the search being summer. We needed to start sooner than later, and we wanted an application period of a good length to attract as many candidates as possible. Next, you'll see the full search calendar. Again, those are in your materials. Here's a piece that I want to talk about, the confidentiality agreement that you have signed to be a part of this process, board members and non-board members. The point that I want to make here is, as I've already mentioned, the confidentiality of this exceeds even the end of the search. So there won't be a time that you'll be able to talk about anything that you see in executive session, the applicant pool, the conversations that are had at any time. And even during the search, as I've already said, you're not allowed to talk to one another outside of executive session. We'll have those conversations in executive session. All right, so next was the screening do's and don'ts. Again, I'm going to blaze through this pretty quickly. I've already mentioned a couple of these in terms of reading each application carefully, matching it to the qualities and qualifications, which I'll show you that in just a moment inside your scoring guides. The don'ts, very important that you look at those categories, that we not discriminate based on any of those categories. It's pretty hard to see some of that in the materials. It comes into play a little bit later when we do the internet, social media checks or reference checks or even the interviews themselves. And I would say the one that comes into play that I have to stop people mid-sentence on more than any out of that whole list is age. I'll get a comment about a candidate's age and I'll have to stop you mid-sentence. Other than that, I don't find a lot of violations or questions around some of the others. All right, here's the big one. It's highlighted. The one that's highlighted says, don't contact candidates or references during this phase of the search. That will be done. There is a role for that in the search, but this is board, this is screening committee members. At this time, you're not to go on the internet. You don't contact references. That's not your role currently. Now, you may know some of the candidates in the pool. You may have internal candidates in the pool. Do not reach out to them. If it's a coworker or somebody that you know and you might see during this process, please do not discuss the search with them. If they approach you and they want information, say, no, thank you, I can't talk to you. Keep that line of confidentiality pretty bright. And also, while I'm thinking about it, any and all information, any notes that you make at any time during the search, keep them. They will be collected at the end of the search or when your role is done. And they must be kept, and Julie, you and I will work with this, but all the materials from the search will be kept for a minimum of 3 years once the search is completed. That's just public meeting law. Essentially, they're not subject to public disclosure, but they have to be kept because they are a public document. And we'll seal that up and put a date on it in 3 years sometime in the future, then all those materials can be destroyed, but they have to be kept for the next 3 years. So any notes that you take, even on the back of a cocktail napkin, please keep it in the folder, and Julie and I will collect that at the end of the search. All right, before I get into some specifics, questions, comments, especially around the confidentiality. And do we still have the one person online? Okay. And I assume if they have questions, they'll be able to.
They can chat.
Okay. You'll alert me if they have any questions. Okay. Thank you very much. All right, so let's continue. And again, I'm going to go pretty quick. Please stop me if you have questions. First thing I want to talk about is a resume for an educator. Again, I know without really asking, and I didn't spend a lot of time initially in terms of your roles and what work experience you've had, but my guess is there's a lot of people in the room that have done hiring, they've looked at resumes, they've seen cover letters. So you have some familiarity with this type of process. So the resume for an educator especially, they're going to come in all different sizes and formats. This is one that rarely gets standardized. I would say all of them will have their education on it. Doesn't always come up front. Sometimes it comes at the end. It'll probably have their work experience, usually in chronological order from most recent to least recent, but not always. But for an educator, the thing that I want to point out is a work year for an educator primarily is from July to June. Now they may start in August, may end in May, but for the most part, if it's a year-round employee, and certainly a superintendent, would be July to June for the most part. The reason I mention that is if you see anything different than that, that's a bit of a red flag, and you want to note it. It's not ultimately a negative. It doesn't ultimately throw out their application or anything, but if they leave, say, in April or in March, the example that I have on the board, this particular person, you look at their experience, you start there at the bottom, they were a teacher, then they were a middle school principal, they were a district office, and then they were a superintendent. That's a normal progression of work experience for most superintendents, not all, but classroom, building, district office perhaps, and then a superintendent if they have superintendent experience. But you'll notice in this particular case, this person left in April 2002. That should be noted. If this person were granted an interview, we would most definitely dig deep on this particular part of their resume. We'd want to know why. And there could be an absolutely perfect reason for this. So we're not going to hold it against them. We're going to note it. Now you go on to notice that the next couple of years, they started what seems to be their own consulting business. Now to me, this deepens the red flag a little bit because, I wonder what happened in Cascade that perhaps they couldn't find a regular educator job. They had to start their own consulting business. We don't know, but we're going to ask. And then finally, the other piece of this that deepens the red flag for me is when they did come back, they came back at a very, very small district as an elementary principal and then went on to be a superintendent principal. That's a bit of a step back. Again, on paper. Could be absolutely great reasons for all of this, but we would dig deeper in an interview. All right, very quickly, anybody else have what else do you look for in a resume? I've just highlighted a couple of things. Anybody in the room, just share it and I'll repeat it, but what else do you look for? Yes, sir. Right, sorry. If they've bounced around a lot, when you look at the experience, had they been a year or two here, a year or two there? Absolutely. That's, again, could be an excellent reason. They may be a superstar and they worked their way up through the ranks, or maybe they're not a superstar and they couldn't hang on to a job. But absolutely make note of that. Yes, ma'am. Gaps in timelines. Gaps in timelines. Absolutely. Again, could be an excellent reason. Maybe it's a female candidate that took a few years off to start a family, all right? Great. Wouldn't hold that against them. But you look for those things. Anybody else? What else would you look in a resume? Okay, so the list, as my example, had a little bit of community activities. Now again, that can go both ways, right? You might be looking for a superintendent candidate that is involved in the community outside the job. At the same time, perhaps too much is how are they getting their work done, their day job, if you will. All right, the other, which is going to lead us into the cover letter conversation as well, is you're obviously looking for attention to detail. Spelling, grammar, those types of things on a resume. All right, let's talk about cover letter. I've got a couple of examples here. The first one, is what I would call mediocre or maybe even a below average. There's two things that I coach folks to look for, and then I'm going to get you to solicit a couple of others, is one, have they listed their accomplishments? And if they have, are they pretty concrete about what they are? You know, if they improved, say, student learning in a particular district, have they followed that up with some type of data or information? Or are they just saying, hey, I improved, test scores in XYZ district? The other thing to look for in a cover letter is the connection to your district. Have they done their homework? Have they done their research? I coach candidates on the other side of this to make the screening committee and the board feel like this is the only job you're applying for. Now, it's difficult because we know they're probably not, right? But still, I want you to feel like they're connected with you in such a way that you feel like this is the only job that they want, that they're looking for, and they've really made that connection. So do they have some connection or history with your school district? Have they done their homework? And does it show in the cover letter? Very quickly, anybody else, what do you look for in a cover letter, that letter of interest? Many times that's the first thing that's read. That's an excellent point. Those qualities and qualifications. Now, again, we have to be a little bit careful because it wasn't in the application materials. So this is one time where we may have to make an exception to that because it wasn't published. Like I said, I showed you those initial recruitment materials. The other piece, I'll piggyback on what you said, is do they know what the goals of your school district are? Have they connected their work to where you want to go? Is your strategic plan on the web someplace, on the internet, on your website? Have they connected to that in the cover letter? All right, very quickly, any other tips for cover letters? Can they write? Can they write? This is, a resume is like a bulleted list, right? But this is where they show their written communication. And I just always want you to look for how well they communicate, how they connect, how can they draw you in? Or is it, a very long, boring, essay on something that, again, it's not the make or break factor, right? But it's a piece that you need to investigate. Here's another one. I hate to say this, but I see it in almost every search. Is it addressed to the right school district? I lost count because I had such a string of, there was at least one candidate in every search that put the wrong district's name in there. Yes, sir.
I can say one more thing that really sends up a red flag. It sounds stupid. It probably is. There's sometimes.
You want to, good. I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, candidates obviously are there to sell themselves, right? So you want to look for evidence in the letters of reference and maybe some of the other materials. But also let me say this while I'm thinking about it. This stage of the search will frustrate you because you will have limited information. You may raise more questions than answers. And that's okay because this is a comprehensive process. This is just stage one. Stage two, we'll do internet and social media checks that lead up to the interviews. That's really phase two together. And then once we've had those interviews, then we move into phase three, which is the reference check. So now we're talking to live people for your finalist. And then your finalist, which is the fourth phase of this, is that meet and greet day in the community. They're going to come into this community. You're going to get to meet them. There's going to be a second interview. There's going to be some interaction. By the time you get through all four of those phases, you will have a lot of information. You won't have it in the first phase. So just know that there'll be some frustration there potentially because you're like, oh, I'm going to pick up the phone and call somebody, or I want to know more about this, and you don't have anybody that you can ask. Now, all those questions we try to take note of, and we try to bring it up in the interview phase. So it's not wasted. It's frustrating, but it's not wasted. All right, moving on. The second cover letter there just shows you a little better. They make a little more expansion in that first highlighted paragraph about their accomplishments, but in the second highlighted paragraph, I think they do a little better job of trying to connect with the district. We've talked about, spelling and grammar and voice and can they write. All right, moving on, letters of reference. Now, when we say current letters of reference, ideally, I like to see letters within 3 years, 5 years at the most. Some of it's going to depend on your candidates. If they've been in the same job for 15 years, then you're probably only going to have current letters of reference, perhaps from their most recent employer. If they reach back to some of those later districts, then those are going to be older letters of reference. But we try to stress and emphasize current letters of reference. And again, when I coach candidates on the other side of this, I ask them, go back, have them rewrite that letter of reference, put a new date on it, update it so that it's current and you're not getting a whole lot of old information. But the other thing to look for in a letter of reference is what's not written. I mean, it's great. When you look at this first one, you see a lot of detail, enthusiasm. You're really looking at the tone. You go to the bottom here, it says, I can't think of a better person. I mean, this to me just screams this supervisor or whoever's writing this letter of reference really likes this particular candidate. The next one and again, I'd be a little careful to judge on length alone. Sometimes a good reference letter can be very enthusiastic but be short. So it's not just the length of this one, but really the lack of specifics and the lack of enthusiasm. And that last line, it's begging for a phone call. To me, this is a person that wrote a letter of reference that didn't really want to write a letter of reference. And my very quick story on this is, in my experience, most people, when asked, will write a letter of reference, whether they want to or not. Very few will say no. And I had that experience. I said no to an administrator under my watch. And last time he spoke to me. I mean, it's just, that's the short version of that story. It's difficult. It was a very strained relationship. And so when I went to my mentor at the time and asked him, how do you handle this situation? He says, I always write the letter of reference. It's what I don't write in a letter of reference that should get people's attention. I write it in such a way that I want them to contact me and so forth. I didn't like that response, but that was his response. And so I think that's what more people do than not. So really read between the lines. Again, you cannot comment. I mean, you cannot comment. You cannot call or connect with the letters of reference. That will be the board's role later in the process. All right, anyone else? What do you look for in a letter of reference? I've left out a couple that I can think of, but we'll phone a friend here. Poll the audience. What else do you look for in a letter of reference? Mom? Yeah. Excellent. I was just getting ready to say that. You want to look at who it's from. And you want to make sure in their collection that there's at least one, if not more, from people that have supervised this individual. Now, one exception that you may need to make is a current sitting superintendent. Early in the process, superintendents, well, all the candidates, the names are confidential. The only names that will be released will be at the end when you've chosen your finalist and they've given us permission to release their names. Because at that point in time, we've got to do reference checks. The board will have the option to do a site visit if it would like to do a site visit. And of course, obviously, they're going to come to your community, so their names are going to be known. And those are the only names that will be released. So everything else is kept confidential. And so for sitting superintendents, a lot of times they will withhold letters of reference from their board members because they don't want to tell their board yet. Because even in telling their board, they could damage that relationship. And I would say more there than in other situations. If I was an assistant superintendent, less likely to damage that relationship with my boss than it is with a board for some reason. So just know if there's not current letters of reference from sitting superintendents and their current board, that's not unusual. All right, anything else in a letter of reference? Who they're from is very important. Now we do, and let me get off camera here for just a second. Because you do have hard copies of these. So yeah, just they just need one. So we'll just start that way. You already have yours. Okay. You just need one to look at. You have yours, you have yours. Right, all right, my tag group here in the back, all right. Now Julie has Xeroxed a lot of these, and you're going to want, and I can give you this number. This is the one piece of information that you can share with the world, and the only piece of information that can be shared with the world about your candidate pool. And that's the number of applicants. I can tell you how many copies of this rating sheet you're going to need. And Julie, you may have to copy more, I know, because you don't know this yet either. And again, I want to emphasize this is the only characteristic of your candidate pool that you can share. You can't share whether you have in-district candidates or not. You can't share male, female, in-state, out-of-state. Any other characteristic cannot be shared, but you have 20 applicants for your position. So when asked, you could say, we had 20 people apply. So you'll need 20 of these rating sheets. Now, you don't have to use the rating sheets. They don't get turned into me or my colleague. They are there to help you organize your thoughts because, as I said earlier, you won't be able to print out hard copies of the materials. It's all captured on the database. It stays on the database. It's confidential, but you need some way to organize your notes. If you like to use the rating sheet, please feel free to do that. If not, you just like to write it out on a legal pad. Like I said earlier, the back of a cocktail napkin. Not that I'm trying to imply anything there, but whatever odd pieces of paper that you may write notes on, make sure you keep all of those. So anyway, here's the rating sheet. Let me briefly go through it. Obviously, you can see at the top, there's the name of the candidate, their current position, their education level. There's a kind of chart here for experience. A lot of screeners want to keep track of, did they have teaching experience? If so, how much? And so forth and so on. Now, this next section is those qualities and qualifications that the board approved, got staff and community input on through the survey, and this is the lens by which we are going to look at the application materials. Normally, there is a separate essay that candidates write in terms of how they meet these qualities and qualifications. But we, again, for the sake of time, we reverse that process a little bit so you don't have that essay this time. So you're going to have to kind of piece together from all the other materials how well candidates demonstrated effective communication and listening skills, how they have a high degree of integrity or honesty with strong core values. Some of this will come out more strongly than others in the materials. Again, you don't have to rate each one of these if you don't want to. It's just a way to help organize your thinking as you go through the materials. But this is the qualities and qualifications that we will use at the core of our lens. All right, you see another section here, which is letters of recommendation. Again, you can keep track of the types, what your overall thoughts were about those letters of recommendation. You see a small space to keep notes because we try to keep this to a single page front and back. Now, if you're like me and you take copious notes, you're going to be attaching a lot of extra sheets to this. Absolutely fine. Please keep track of them. And at the bottom, you have this, I recommend this candidate for an interview, a yes, no, and a maybe. Let me explain one possible way to organize yourselves in what I call the 3-pile method. So you've done an applicant, you've gone through all their materials, you've written this. What's your initial reaction? Yes, no, maybe, in terms of should this person be granted an interview? So by the time you go through all 20 applicants, then you're going to have 3 piles. You're going to have some that immediately grab you and you think, yes, they need an interview. You've got some that are going to be, no, not really. And you're going to put them in that pile, and then you're going to have some maybes. Because in the end, we're going to ask every one of you to give us your top 10. Not 7, not 8, not 9, 10, because it makes the math work out. All right, everybody's going to give 10, even if you think, well, only 5 deserve an interview. That's fine, put them in your top 5. But I'm going to ask you to put in a 6, a 7, an 8, a 9, and a 10. So everybody's going to do 10. We put all that math together, and then a week from tonight, we come back together, and I show those ratings to you as a group. And that's when we'll talk about candidates, and I'll explain that process in just a few minutes. So if you choose to use the 3-pile method, that's great. If you have another method that you come up with, that's fine too. But that's why this yes, no, maybe is across the bottom. Because at the end, you've got 3 piles. So I would say go to your yes pile, say there's 4 of them, and put them in order. They're probably your top 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And then go to your maybe pile. Let's say you've got 4 maybes, and you put them in order. That's 5, 6, 7, 8. Well, Steve said I had to do 10, and he's kind of a butt about it, so I'm going to have to do 10, right? So you go to your no pile, and you find a number 9 and a number 10. And that's your top 10. Okay? And I can tell you the number of times that I've done this process in the end, your cream will rise to the top. Your cream, because your cream is different from another district. I've seen some candidates rise very high in some school districts and not so high in another district. It's really what are you looking for in the work and the experience and the qualities and qualifications that they bring. And it's always different community to community. But just know that somewhere in that top 7, 8, 9 are people worthy of an interview. Your board will feather that out and then invite those people in for an interview, and then we'll continue the process. Remember, you're going to be frustrated by the lack of information. So it won't be perfect, but your cream will rise to the top in terms of who to invite in for an interview. All right, that's the screening, that's the scoring guide. That's kind of the application materials in a nutshell. I should probably take a breath and say, are there any questions? That's an excellent question and observation. What did I do with it? Anytime before your deadline, you'll have access to all the candidates. You can go back and change your mind. You can change your rankings. And you actually maybe think of a recommendation that I like to make, which is to read 2 or 3 before you really start taking any notes or doing any yes, no, maybe piles. Because you'd want to do exactly that. You want to kind of do a couple and get into a bit of a rhythm, a bit of a, all right, I know what I'm looking for. I'm used to the database. And now go back and really start working in earnest. But yes, you have access to all 20 candidates right up. Well, you will have through this entire process. But the deadline, and I'm going to mention it now because I'm thinking of it, is Sunday, the 25th by midnight. Your rankings must be in the database that I'm going to show you next by Sunday midnight because we work on Monday. And my colleague and I have to take all those rankings, prepare your report, and then I'll bring it to the executive session on Monday night. So midnight Sunday. And my strongest encouragement, and I know you all are very busy and you've got other jobs, is to please start before Sunday after church or whatever your Sunday morning activities are. All right. And I'm speaking as a I'd like to say reformed procrastinator, but I'm not very reformed. All right. Because I'd wait till 1 o'clock on Sunday. And please don't. At least initially, make sure you can get in. You've done 2 or 3 practices. Because it'll take you 20, minimum 30 minutes for each candidate. You have a minimum of 10, probably 15 hours. And again, a lot of that depends on how fast you read, how much notes you take. And again, I just want to caution folks, we're just trying to feather out who gets an interview the next phase of the search. We're not choosing your superintendent from the paperwork. So just kind of keep that in mind, as I have some screeners, board members that sweat the really, really, really small stuff. And again, you're not going to have enough information to do that. So, all right, Sunday, the 25th by midnight. Other questions around the application? Because I've got 30 minutes and I'm going to be done on time, and Julie's going to make sure I'm done on time. I want to make sure the board has a break before your board meeting. And I also want to say thank you for coming in a little early, doing this first, and allowing people to come in and get the training and then leave if they want, and then board doing your work afterwards is much appreciated on my behalf and theirs behalf as well. And I hope you don't have a long board meeting tonight, but I probably won't be here for it. So anyway, thank you, because I'll be traveling home. Sorry, I don't mean to be too blunt about that. Also, before I get into the database, let me describe a little bit about what's going to happen next week and be very clear on our roles and responsibilities. Again, once the training's done tonight, tomorrow morning, the database, you'll have access to it. All of you should have received an email already that asks you to set up your account with Revelis, which if you'll turn the screen on, you'll see, there we go. Revelis, I'll show you that website where we're going to go there in just a moment. And again, that'll be tomorrow morning. You've got a lot of work to do over the next several days. Again, I apologize for the short timeline, but it was necessary to meet the requirements of the board and try to bring a person on as soon as possible to make a smooth transition. So next week when we get together, and I'm not sure the time has been identified yet, that's something that can be discussed towards the end, so we all know what time we're going to be here next week. But the first part of it, I will reveal the rankings. We'll go right into executive session next Monday at whatever time we start. I'll reveal the rankings. And usually with a committee of this size, I'll divide up the rankings into board and screening committees. So I have 2 different sets of rankings, but the rankings that we'll work from is the combined rankings. And then I'll make some recommendations about where to start, because we won't talk about all 20 candidates necessarily. We'll talk about as many as the board wishes to talk about. But you can see from the initial paper screening and the numbers that I'm going to show you where you have high interest and where you have low interest. And so we'll start that conversation. We'll talk about as many candidates as we need to talk about. And I generally do it in this way. Board, you will be in listening mode. You'll be taking notes, because the screening committee is going to answer 2 questions for each candidate that we decide to talk about. So let's say we're talking about Steve Kelly, and I'm going to say, all right, board, take out your notes on Steve Kelly. Screening committee, first question, what were the strengths that you saw in the application? And then I'll go around the room, or virtually, or how we're set up, and ask for screening committees to briefly share what they saw in terms of strengths. Then the second question is, what concerns do you have about the candidate? And we'll do that for each candidate. And board, you're taking notes. You will have an opportunity to ask follow-up questions or clarifying questions, but the intent of the first 90 minutes to maybe 2 hours is for the screening committee to give feedback to the board, because that's the role of the screening committee. When we're done screening committee, and it's usually that 90 minutes to 2 hour time mark, your evening is done. You will be dismissed from executive session, and it'll be just the board. And at that point in time, the board then deliberates on who's going to be invited for an interview. So I'm trying to draw a pretty clear line between those that are giving feedback and those that are ultimately making the decision around who's going to be interviewed. And for the board, sometimes that can be very quick, 20, 30 minutes. Sometimes it can be an hour or more. And then we'll come out of executive session into public session, and board, there'll be some work that we'll need to do there in terms of the interview schedule. I'll have to do some very brief training on internet, social media checks, and so forth. So there's some training. So for the board, it's a 3 or 4 hour evening. So my encouragement when we do talk about start times is as reasonably that can accommodate everyone, I would suggest that you start your evening as early as possible. 5 o'clock would be ideal. If that's what people could make happen today, that would be my encouragement. So that's next Monday. That's the process that we'll use. Also, Jason, remind me, I think we talked about the screening committee observing the interviews. Okay. And I can talk more about this next week, but I just wanted to say that screening committee, your job is not done next Monday. Once you've given your feedback, the board would like for you, and I believe the interviews will be held virtually. I'm not sure the board has made that final decision yet. But however they're held, we want to accommodate the screening committee to be able to observe and give feedback to the board during that process as well. Now, the interview dates and times have not been set yet and won't be set until next Monday. You would hear from me on Tuesday. This is when the dates are set. You're invited to come. You don't have to come. You don't have to come to all of them because you're not ranking the candidates. You're just providing feedback. Board, obviously, you have to sit through all the interviews because ultimately you will rank them and choose your finalist. Questions, thoughts? All right. I'm going to go through and just essentially show you, because I can do this live. Once we go into executive session, I can show you a lot of these screens live. But what I want to show you in your materials is you have screenshots of everything that I'm going to do live in just a few moments. And so you've got Sarah's contact information there and her work phone number. I'm the crazy person. I give you my personal cell phone. So please, you know, she's got a little one in a family and I'm an empty nester, so you can bug the heck out of me. But during the day, she's Johnny on the spot. And she'll help you as well. So there at the top, I want to just draw your attention to OregonSchoolBoards.myrevelis.com. Don't go to the regular OSBA website because that's not where this is housed. All right. So you make sure that when you put in when you're looking for this database, that it's OregonSchoolBoards.myrevelis.com. And again, that's in your training materials. You'll see the login in the upper right-hand corner. Once you do that, it's going to bring you to this screen. You've already set up your username, which is your email address, your password you have set up. And then you're going to see something like this, which is going to be a list of your candidates. And again, I'm going to take you live in just a moment. Just want you to know that all this stuff is here. And then once you get inside a particular candidate, this is the format that you're going to see. On the left-hand side is a column of blue links. You click on those links, or you can click on the little plus sign where you see the arrow there. In the upper right-hand corner, I like how, and we purchased this from another state association, and that's where this database is housed. And I like how they've kind of formatted this, but in the upper right-hand corner, you see the letter of interest and the resume. And my coaching to you would be start with that letter of reference, or that letter of interest, I mean. Get to know the candidate a little bit, go into that resume, and then go into some of these other links. Now, all those links on the left-hand side, you do not have to go into each and every one of those. Some of it is like their address or personal information, the education history, current employment. That's all on the resume. But that was part of the application, so that's why it's there. I'll show you in a moment on a live version kind of the links that you will use the most often And they're also illustrated here. Upper right-hand corner, that's what I just mentioned. Letters of reference, you can see there's in highlighted in light blue, it says upload at least 3 reference letters. You click on that, it opens up another menu, and then you'll click on those documents. Yeah, I'm going to show you all this live, so let's not waste too much time here. Again, just know that there are screenshots of all of this stuff. I just want to get down to the end and show you this a couple of times. So when you get down to the very end, and this is just one applicant, there's a space that says My Feedback. Don't use that. Make all your notes on paper, because it's going to be a lot easier for you to look at that paper copy next week and that process that I described. Below that is the rating. And when you click on that, it's going to drop down a menu of 1 to 10. So in the end, once you've gone through all 20 applicants, then you're going to come back in the database and rate the top 10. So you would come into, let's say John Doe here was your number 2. So you go back in after you're all done and you've got your top 10 pile or list or dartboard, however you choose to do it. Hopefully not a dartboard. And go back in. John Doe is number 2. So then you click on this rating. You'll highlight the number 2, and then you'll hit save. Now, if a day later you come back and say, oh, no, I think Steve Kelly's number 2, John Doe is number 3, you can go back and change it. All right. I've got about 15 minutes left, so I want to spend the remaining time that I have actually looking at the database. And so we're going to go into executive session. And once we do that, then I will go on the internet. I'll show you exactly how to log in using my test login. I'll show you some other pieces. Again, it's going to be a little hard to see on the screen, but again, you've got my number. First thing in the morning, check your accounts to make sure you can get in there. And then, of course, if you have any questions, please let me know. So we're ready to go into executive session. Absolutely understand.